Hello. The episode you're about to listen to is part of a multi part series introducing an overview of Japanese history. This is a repeat of one of the original projects the History of Japan podcast was built on, and is intended to serve as an update and supplement to these original works. After 10 years, my hope is to return to this approach and to do it a little bit better given the skills that I have improved in the intervening years. If you haven't been doing so already, you should listen to these episodes sequentially, starting with episode 501. Without any further ado, enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 510, The Rise of the Warriors. As we've seen over the past 9 episodes, the history of early Japanese politics is defined by the power struggle between the aristocratic clans of Japan and the imperial family, with the former largely coming out on top and in particular coming to dominate the Japanese state after the death of Emperor Kanmu and his immediate heirs. The dominance of the aristocrats, led by the powerful northern line of the Fujiwara family, would not, however, last. It would be challenged and ultimately defeated by the rise of a new political force in Japan in the warrior class. Well, not new, as we've seen. The roots of what came to be known as the samurai class go back to the late 700s, so 2 centuries before the real start of warrior entry into politics. And by the 900s, the power of independent warrior families was growing to the point that, at least in the provinces, well-connected warriors could threaten the smooth and stable functioning of government. Still, what this all meant in practice was that powerful warriors were now one more interest group among many jockeying for influence over the government. They were powerful, yes, but they had to compete with the major aristocratic families, with wealthy religious institutions, with provincial governors, local landholders, even the occasional uppity member of the imperial family trying to claw back some semblance of control and power. And besides, it was not at this point as if the warrior class represented any sort of politically unified front. Warriors were united by ties of political and familial allegiance, or more prosaically, by financial or economic alliances. Competition between rival blocks of warriors, who were, after all, fighting over similar sources of power, was often far fiercer than warrior competition with these other interest groups. For example, there are a pair of wars in the mid-1000s, the former 9 Years' War and latter 3 Years' War, that are often pointed to as showing the emerging and destabilizing power of the warrior class in politics, presaging the conflicts of the next century. And it certainly is true that these wars were destabilizing politically, but it's also worth noting that they were conflicts between warrior families fighting over their own economic prerogatives. Specifically, the conflicts emerged over disputes in remote Mutsu province, a massive area now spread across Akita, Fukushima, Miyagi, Iwate, and Aomori prefectures on the northern end of Honshu. Mutsu province was part of the territory conquered from the aboriginal Emishi peoples over the course of the 800s, and even in the mid-1000s there was still a large and culturally distinct Emishi population in the area. Because of this large and potentially hostile population, the Kyoto court had decided to appoint a clan of aristocrats turned warriors, the Abe family, descended from a distant branch of the imperial line, to serve as military administrators of the area. They would operate alongside the provincial governor, coordinating the local warrior population to keep things under control. But the Abe and said appointed governors did not always see eye to eye, and in the ensuing political clashes, the Abe more often than not came out on top. After all, if nothing else, provincial governors were term limited for their office, after which they rotated out and were replaced, where the Abe stuck around and were able to build up a substantial and independent base of allies and dependents in Mutsu. By 1050, the current head of the Abe clan, Abe no Yoritoki, had developed such a strong independent power base, he began largely ignoring the directives of the central government and doing things like collecting taxes in his own name, a job normally reserved for the provincial governor. When said governor, a distant Fujiwara relative, was appointed for Mutsu and started trying to order Yoritoki to, not do that, Yoritoki responded by mobilizing his followers and attacking the governor's mansion. Now, Yoritoki was probably hoping to force some sort of settlement out of the Fujiwara. After all, why would they bother fighting over a remote place like Mutsu? But if that was the hope, things didn't quite pan out. The northern Fujiwara had been cultivating their own alliance with a powerful warrior family, the Seiwa Minamoto, one of the groups descended from a former emperor's extra sons. And so the current head of the Seiwa Minamoto clan, Minamoto no Yoriyoshi, was appointed both the new provincial governor and Chinfu Shogun, commander of all military forces in the northern end of the country, by the northern Fujiwara regent, and told to bring Abe no Yoritoki under control. Before long, Yoritoki was able to negotiate an amnesty with the central government, driven by the illness of a member of the imperial family, Empress Shoshi. Yoritoki and his supporters were supposed to pray for her recovery as part of the peace deal, and I guess it worked, because she did recover and would live for 2 more decades. However, in 1056, the ceasefire broke down, right as Minamoto no Yoriyoshi's time as Mutsu's provincial governor was coming to an end. The inciting incident for the breakdown was a nighttime raid on Yoriyoshi's camp by unknown forces. Yoriyoshi accused the Abe clan, and in particular Abe no Yoritoki's son, Abe no Sadato, of being behind the attack and demanded the boy be handed over to him. Yoritoki refused to do so, and when this came across, Yoriyoshi mobilized his forces and wrote to Kyoto for an order, which he did receive, to deliver imperial punishment onto the Abe. This time the fighting did not end quickly. It would continue until 1063. Initially, the Abe held the upper hand, defeating the Minamoto forces and nearly crushing them altogether, until a rebellion by an Abe clan relative forced Yoritoki to split his attention. Eventually, that rebellion would end up killing him. But even divided, it took years for the Minamoto to finish off the Abe clan. Still, the war succeeded in making the reputation of the Minamoto as fierce warriors, and in particular, Yoriyoshi and his son and heir Yoriie, who had been 15 when the fighting began and essentially grew up fighting the war in Mutsu. The former 9 Years' War was a comparatively large conflict for the time, but its basic organization was not unusual, and again, not really a direct threat to the Kyoto government. It was largely an internal dispute between 2 warrior families, the Minamoto and the Abe. Ditto the related latter 3 Years' War, which we're not even going to go into that much detail about. Basically, this was another fight in Mutsu, this time between Minamoto no Yoriie, who himself had become provincial governor in the 1080s, and another local warrior clan, the Kiyohara. The Kiyohara had been invited into Mutsu to help put down the Abe clan in the 1050s, but had since fragmented into competing lineages, which were fighting an internal family civil war. Yoriie, as provincial governor, intervened to bring the fighting to an end. So here, too, the issue was a private dispute between warrior families. Indeed, that was the interpretation of the central government, which actually successfully placed Minamoto no Yoriie under house arrest after the war ended, on the grounds that he pursued a private vendetta against the fragmented Kiyohara clan outside of the bounds of his mandate as governor. This was not, in other words, what lay the groundwork for the upending of the Heian system. What really did that was not the power of the warrior clans in and of itself, but a shift in the balance of power in Kyoto, which created a vacuum at the center. From the time of Fujiwara no Yoshifusa, who we talked about back in episode 507, the northern branch of the Fujiwara family had dominated politics through 2 means: political marriages into the imperial family, ensuring that future heirs were at least part Fujiwara, and monopolization of the two posts of imperial regent, Sessho for child emperors, Kampaku for adult ones. And that system, alongside two other long-standing political rules, a requirement that the Dajokan, or Council of State, draft the language of imperial edicts rather than the emperor himself, and that the emperor observe debates of state ministers behind a curtain and without participating, limited the direct ability of the emperors themselves to intervene in politics. Those limitations, alongside manipulation of the succession and the provision of Fujiwara concubines to the emperors, allowed the Fujiwara to dominate court politics from the 850s well into the early 1000s. However, during the 1000s, a new locus of power began to emerge at the imperial court to challenge the Fujiwara regents, the In, or retired emperor. Being emperor, you see, is kind of an exhausting job. By the Heian era, the emperors were not involved that much in actual administration, and were even further removed from those roles as time went on, and were concerned far more with ritual and cultural activities. Luckily for them, you were not expected to do the job too long, because a combination of concerns about the return to bloody succession wars of the Nara years and earlier, and a desire on the part of the Fujiwara regents to keep younger, Fujiwara-descended and theoretically pliable emperors on the throne, led to a change in how the imperial rule tended to play out. Rather than remaining on the throne until they died, emperors were now encouraged to abdicate and hand over power to a chosen successor, keeping the lines of succession uncomplicated, which was important given the number of imperial princes floating about, and generally serving as a preventative against older emperors more likely to chafe against Fujiwara rule. Once an emperor abdicated, they became an In, a retired sovereign. The Ritsuryo system didn't actually have a legal provision for the status of retired emperor, but in practice, they retained much of the prestige associated with their old gig, and as older men in the imperial line, the oldest retired emperor tended to be the de facto head of household for the imperial family itself. In addition, they were often rewarded with lands and independent sources of wealth in recognition of their former status. All of which meant that in practice, the In became one more faction vying for power in the Heian system, joining a factional struggle between the Fujiwara, the other aristocratic houses, the warriors, the provincial governors, local landlords, and religious institutions. That factionalism in turn was put into overdrive by, as we saw last week, the fact that these groups could rely on increasingly extra-governmental sources of power, chiefly their Shoen landholdings. Eventually, what emerged was a sort of bizarre dual regency, with both the retired emperors and the northern Fujiwara regents battling for influence over the seated emperor. Initially, the Fujiwara were not looking like they'd relinquish their hold anytime soon, but amazingly, right at the apogee of Fujiwara power, things fell apart. That apogee came under Fujiwara no Yorimichi, who served as regent for an astonishing 51 years across the reigns of 3 different emperors, from 1017 to 1068. Yorimichi's incredibly long tenure in office allowed him to fill up the Oku, the inner palace of the emperor, with loads of Fujiwara clan daughters, most prominently 3 of his own, but in one of those random twists of fate, none of those daughters had a son. Years of Chinese influence had made the old solution, go to a female sovereign, a non-starter, and so Yorimichi was forced in 1068 to allow the ascension of an emperor who was both an adult and not a Fujiwara relative, Emperor Go-Sanjo. Go-Sanjo's health was, fortunately for the Fujiwara, not the best. His tenure in office was also not impressive in terms of results. He was the one who, as we talked about last week, attempted to deal with no real success with the spread of the Shoen system. However, Go-Sanjo's desire to claw back more power for the imperial family did have one important result. He appointed his own heir, once again a non-Fujiwara, who took the throne as Emperor Shirakawa in 1072, a year before Go-Sanjo died. In his essay on the politics of Heian Japan, Mikhail Adolfsson calls Shirakawa the most talented emperor politically since the reign of Kanmu more than 200 years earlier. Frankly, he is pretty spot on. Shirakawa would remain on the throne for 14 years, from the time he was 19 to the age of 33 by the Western count, before he abdicated, following Go-Sanjo's lead in taking the chance to name his own heir, once again a non-Fujiwara. As the retired emperor, he then oversaw the politics of the imperial family for the next several decades until his death in 1129, helped along by the fact that the northern Fujiwara were left a bit leaderless when two of their family heads died unexpectedly in 1099 and 1101. Shirakawa took advantage of the chaos of the northern Fujiwara leadership to, in essence, copy their political playbook. First, of course, was control of the succession. As retired emperor, Shirakawa oversaw a line of anti-Fujiwara emperors descended directly from him, Emperors Horikawa, Toba, and Sutoku, his son, grandson, and great-grandson. He thus ensured the Fujiwara could not directly control the throne by planting a pliant young relative upon it. Second, while Shirakawa did continue his predecessor's policies around reigning in the Shoen, significantly he took the step of trying to get the imperial family Shoen of its own, usually in the name of one of the many imperial princes, since theoretically emperors themselves could not hold land. These tax-free Shoen estates became completely independent bases of economic power for the imperial family itself. Next, Shirakawa began to set up imperially controlled religious institutions and dispatch imperial relatives to serve as priests and abbots at influential temples and shrines, essentially battling the Fujiwara for control of major religious institutions and the legitimacy they could provide. And finally, Shirakawa began to cut deals with warrior families. In particular, just as the northern Fujiwara had developed a close alliance with the Seiwa Minamoto, Shirakawa cultivated an alliance with another powerful warrior family, the Kanmu branch of the Taira clan. Shirakawa also cultivated warriors loyal directly to him, essentially buying followers by provisioning them with their own estates. As a result, by the time Shirakawa died in 1129, the imperial house was, in many ways, a totally independent political power in its own right. The modern-day historian Kuroda Toshio described the political order that emerged from this as a sort of co-rulership model where power was shared between various kenmon, a term that originally meant noble houses, but which came to mean any of the major power holders of the late Heian era. Kuroda identified these kenmon as having 5 basic things in common. First, they had a distinctive institutional or family headquarters, independent from the Kyoto government. Second, that headquarters was ruled by an independent head of household, whose job was not the result of government office, but of family or institutional inheritance. Thus, their authority was not legally derived from the government. Third, said leader had an independent base of followers, pledged personally to him. Fourth, the kenmon were self-ruling, having their own systems for promoting or demoting followers, or dealing with internal disputes without government interference. Fifth and finally, the kenmon had independent bases of political and economic power, usually shoen, over which their authority was legally absolute, as government agents could not, say, enter a Fujiwara shoen without the permission of the Fujiwara owner. This definition certainly fit the northern Fujiwara and to a lesser extent other aristocratic families or lesser Fujiwara offshoots. Thanks to Shirakawa, it fit the imperial family too, and it fit powerful religious institutions like the Tendai sect temple of Enryakuji atop Mount Hiei, or the powerful temples of Nara, which had successfully used their influence to lobby for power of their own. And by the 1100s, it increasingly fit the warrior families, especially major and well-connected ones politically, like the Seiwa Minamoto and Kanmu Taira. Read through this lens, what enabled the rise of the samurai to political power was the kenmonization, or in other words, the fragmentation of political power into these different independent groups, creating an unstable political situation into which samurai families could insert themselves. Of course, that's a rather dry way of framing things, even if it is accurate to the balance of power. Viewed less abstractly, the reality is substantially bloodier. In particular, the rise of the samurai to political power is often tied to three distinct conflicts: the Hogen and Heiji rebellions, followed by the Genpei War. The rest of this episode is going to be about detailing the first two conflicts. We'll pick up with the third at the start of next week. So first, the Hogen Rebellion, named of course via the Nengo era name system, as the year of the rebellion, 1156, was also the first year of the Hogen era. The Hogen Rebellion grew out of the death of a man who had come, over the course of his lifetime, to dominate the politics of Kyoto, Emperor Toba, the grandson of Shirakawa and retired emperor. You see, as successful as the retired emperors were in bolstering the power of the imperial family, particularly relative to the Fujiwara regents, that success didn't come without a cost. There was always a bit of resentment of the senior-most retired emperors, acting as the patriarchs of the imperial clan. First, that resentment came from the reigning emperor, who was, after all, supposed to be the master of the proverbial house, but now had to take orders from their elders. Second, it came from the younger retired emperors who were excluded from the power of the senior retired emperor. Shirakawa had generally been able to balance these competing political prerogatives and keep folks within the imperial family working together. Emperor Toba, however, had far less talent for this sort of thing, and managed to foster two substantial rivalries within powerful families that would blow up in a huge way after his death. First was a rivalry within the imperial family itself, between the retired emperor Sutoku and the reigning emperor at the time of Toba's death, Go Shirakawa. Sutoku was legally the eldest son of Toba, but for whatever reason the two never got along. The theory that flew around Kyoto was that, in fact, Toba's father Shirakawa had slept with one of Toba's wives out of wedlock, and that Sutoku was the product of that union. Which I guess would certainly make for a complicated familial relationship if your son was actually your father's love child. Regardless of whether or not that rumor is true, Sutoku was forced to abdicate in 1141 in favor of one of Toba's other sons, Emperor Konoe. He apparently resented this quite a bit. As junior retired emperor, Sutoku then pinned his hopes on Konoe naming one of Sutoku's sons as his heir, since Konoe had none of his own. However, when Konoe died unexpectedly in 1155 without naming an heir, Toba, as the senior retired emperor, again stepped in to name a different one of his sons, Emperor Go Shirakawa, and position Go Shirakawa's own son as heir. This blocked anyone from Sutoku's lineage of having any shot at the throne, and it pissed Sutoku off mightily, and that resentment would come to the surface the next year when Toba died. The second familial split the retired Emperor Toba exacerbated was actually within the northern Fujiwara. Toba's grandfather, the retired Emperor Shirakawa, had manufactured a pretext to exile the head of the northern Fujiwara, Fujiwara no Tadazane, from Kyoto, obviously intended to weaken the northern Fujiwara by forcing their leader from the center of power. Toba, however, recalled Fujiwara no Tadazane from exile, hoping to form a political alliance with him. This worked for a time, but Tadazane also busily set about trying to rebuild the weakened fortunes of the northern Fujiwara clan. He was also apparently not at all pleased with how things had gone in his absence. While he'd been away, his eldest son, Tadamichi, had been handling northern Fujiwara affairs at court, but Tadazane set about trying to oust Tadamichi in favor of his preferred younger son, Fujiwara no Yorinaga. I suppose what brought Toba and Fujiwara no Tadazane together was how much they hated their own eldest sons. Anywho, Tadazane's attempt to oust his eldest in favor of his youngest didn't work. You see, when Emperor Konoe died suddenly in 1155, rumors began to fly around Kyoto he'd been poisoned or hexed in some way, and that Tadazane's favored son Yorinaga had been behind it. It's unclear whether the rumors had anything behind them or if they were pure political opportunism. Regardless, Yorinaga was exiled from politics by virtue of the slander, but the division between pro-Yorinaga and pro-Tadamichi factions within the northern Fujiwara remained. And when the retired emperor Toba died, that resentment blew up without anything left to keep it under control. The retired emperor Sutoku, having lost his shot at the throne or any chance of his children being on it, decided to team up with the exiled Yorinaga to oust Toba's chosen successor and take control of the government for themselves, working together to sort out the familial conflict the old-fashioned way by just killing the relatives you don't like. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone! Both sides, of course, had clients and allies they could call on to support them, including growing numbers of warrior families. In particular, of course, the retired emperors by this point had a close alliance with the Kanmu Taira, while the northern Fujiwara regents had spent over a century cultivating an alliance with the Seiwa Minamoto. But in this particular fight, both sides claimed to represent the interests of the imperial family and the northern Fujiwara, so where would the warrior families come down? In point of fact, they too were split and along generational lines. The family head of the Seiwa Minamoto, Minamoto no Tameyoshi, backed the rebelling Sutoku and Yorinaga, as did the younger brother of the Kanmu Taira leader, Taira no Tadamasa. The Taira family head, Taira no Tadamori, was out of Kyoto at this time, busily fighting pirates in the inland sea. However, Tadamori's son, Kiyomori, was in Kyoto and he backed the reigning emperor, Go Shirakawa, as did Minamoto no Tameyoshi's own son, Minamoto no Yoshitomo. And in this case, the young guns proved the ones to beat. When it became clear things would come to blows, both sides gathered armies of a few hundred in the early summer of 1156. Then, they vacillated as to what to do next. Apparently, it was Minamoto no Yoshitomo who suggested a surprise attack at night against the forces of the rebelling Sutoku and Yorinaga, hoping to win swiftly and decisively. And in the end, this was the right call. Yoshitomo and Taira no Kiyomori led a night attack that crushed the rebellion in the span of a single day. And though the Hogen Rebellion itself only lasted less than 24 hours in terms of the actual fighting, it still marked a big departure from past political eras. Previous succession disputes among powerful families would have been resolved by political maneuvering, manipulation, maybe a couple of exiles to spice things up, but now recourse to military force was easy, and violence, after all, has a way of handling your problems rather permanently. And with the precedent set that this was an option, the winning Emperor Go Shirakawa was not interested in walking things back. Indeed, in his victory, he took the rather unprecedented step urged by one of his closest advisors, Fujiwara no Michinori, better known by his name as a lay Buddhist monk, Shinzei, to finish off the rebel cause. He ordered the first executions in 350 years, since the execution of one of the Fujiwara coup plotters who had been looking to restore Emperor Heizei back to the throne in 810. We talked about that particular issue back in episode 506. In the intervening centuries, it had become more common to commute death sentences to long-term exile. But Go Shirakawa was convinced by his advisor Shinzei that it was time to set an example. Fujiwara no Yorinaga was, I guess luckily for him, killed in the fighting. The retired Emperor Sutoku was captured, having fled to Ninnaji, but his imperial ancestry protected him from execution. He was merely exiled to a remote part of Shikoku. However, 17 of Sutoku and Yorinaga's allies, including Minamoto no Yoshitomo's father Tameyoshi and Taira no Kiyomori's uncle Tadamasa, were executed. Indeed, the Minamoto and Taira scions were given the order to do in their own relatives themselves. And despite following those orders, and essentially winning the whole damn thing for Go Shirakawa in the first place, The rewards for the victorious warriors were rather meager. Kiyomori received a provincial governorship in Harima province. Yoshitomo, who had come up with the winning battle plan in the first place, received a middling appointment within the imperial military bureaucracy, provincial head of the Left Horse Guards, which was a mid-rank position that probably had no power or even stipend. The outcome of the Hogen Rebellion was to establish the ruling emperor Go Shirakawa as the main political force in Kyoto. In 1158, he would abdicate, but continued, naturally, to dominate things behind the scenes as retired emperor. However, Go Shirakawa's victory still left a lot of uncertainty floating around in the air, particularly because the retired emperor could not, of course, rule entirely by himself. In particular, two main camps began to emerge around the new master of Kyoto once he solidified his hold on the city. The first was around that advisor, Shinzei, who had become close to Go Shirakawa because his wife had been the retired emperor's wet nurse. This allowed Shinzei, who was not a northern Fujiwara but a southern Fujiwara, and thus probably would not have risen that high in a more normal political climate, to become one of Go Shirakawa's closest confidants, able to freely give advice like, let's go against over 3 centuries of precedent and start chopping off heads. However, shortly after the Hogen Rebellion, a new figure began to emerge at court, Fujiwara no Nobuyori, from the rival northern Fujiwara. For reasons that are a bit unclear, Nobuyori and Go Shirakawa became increasingly friendly during these years, to the point that Nobuyori became a threat to Shinzei's political power. Shinzei and Nobuyori thus became locked in a contest for influence over Go Shirakawa, and the retired emperor's other followers began to gravitate into one or the other of their orbits as a result. In particular, Taira no Kiyomori sided with Shinzei, while Minamoto no Yoshitomo sided with Fujiwara no Nobuyori. Eventually, Shinzei started to win the political battle. In particular, in 1159, he was able to block the advancement of Nobuyori to a bureaucratic office, essentially a middling post in the Imperial Palace Guard, that was usually a prerequisite for increased court rank. This so incensed Nobuyori that for a time he flat out refused to attend any meeting of the court at all, excusing himself on the grounds that he had to practice the military arts, which is not at all ominous, no sir, especially not since the precedent is now established that if you don't like the political situation, there's probably a warrior out there willing to chop off the heads of your enemies until you do. Which brings us to January 1160, roughly corresponding to the tail end of the first year of the newly named era, Heiji. In that month, Taira no Kiyomori announced a plan to go on pilgrimage to Kumano, a region in the west coast of the Ise Bay, in what's now the southern part of Mie Prefecture. That area is home to many ancient and venerable shrines. More importantly for us, the pilgrimage route there and back was 175 miles, or about 282 kilometers, and once you were there, the mountainous pilgrimage route itself between all the shrines took 5 days or so to traverse. Which meant that for about a month, Shinzei would be without his greatest military supporter in the capital, and, well, I guess you can probably do the math yourself from here. Just 5 days after Kiyomori left town, Fujiwara no Nobuyori began to move against Shinzei, joined by Minamoto no Yoshitomo, whose own fortunes had been frustrated by Shinzei's blocking the rise of his patron. They were joined by another faction of warriors who had no problem with Shinzei per se, but who were loyalists to the sitting emperor Nijo rather than the retired emperor Go Shirakawa. Together, this group attacked Shinzei's residence and the neighboring Sanjo Palace where Go Shirakawa was residing, swiftly capturing both the sitting and retired emperor. Shinzei was able to briefly escape to Nara, but was tracked down and executed after he attempted but failed to commit suicide. His severed head was brought back to Kyoto and put on display like that of a common criminal. Nobuyori, meanwhile, exercised his control of the emperor to purge Shinzei's supporters from all their offices, including Taira no Kiyomori, and to promote both himself and Minamoto no Yoshitomo, giving Yoshitomo many of the positions that had been stripped from Kiyomori. Now, while this was all happening, Taira no Kiyomori was away from the capital. By the time he got wind of what had happened, he was near the tip of the Ki Peninsula, almost a week's ride from Kyoto. After some back and forth on what to do, Kiyomori decided to ride for Kyoto, gathering more of his followers along the way so that he arrived with an armed entourage of 300 men. Initially, Kiyomori seemed to accept defeat, showing a willingness to follow the decisions of the new regime. But then, things flipped on their head. Emperor Nijo had grown increasingly disillusioned with Fujiwara no Nobuyori in particular. His followers had joined Nobuyori and Yoshitomo's uprising out of a belief that Emperor Nijo's political power would be strengthened by it, but instead Nobuyori just started giving Emperor Nijo orders himself. And so, as one big group, they all defected to Kiyomori. Nijo himself supposedly snuck out of the imperial palace to Taira no Kiyomori's villa at Rokuhara by disguising himself as a woman. The very same day, the retired Emperor Go Shirakawa and his followers did the same thing for pretty similar reasons, deserting Nobuyori and fleeing to Kiyomori. Now, this did help flip the military balance of power, but more importantly, the presence of the emperor and the retired emperor gave Kiyomori legitimacy. He could brand himself as defending the imperial cause and his opponents as rebels against the throne. You can probably guess, once again, how things played from here. Once again, the actual fighting only lasted one day. Kiyomori launched an all-out assault the day after Nijo and Go Shirakawa came to him, and though the opposition held out for a time, Kiyomori was able to break them with an ingenious strategy. He ordered his men to fall back after their initial assault on fortified positions around the imperial palace. When Nobuyori and Yoshitomo's forces emerged to chase down what they thought was a fleeing opponent, a second Taira detachment slipped in behind them to seize the emptied fortifications, trapping the Nobuyori and Yoshitomo forces with no line of retreat. Kiyomori then baited them into an attack on his Rokuhara palace, where the opposition was crushed in a matter of hours. Fujiwara no Nobuyori, fleeing in advance of the final battle, was caught near Rokuhara itself and executed on the banks of the Kamo River. He was only 26. Minamoto no Yoshitomo did successfully escape Kyoto to flee east, towards the lands held by the Seiwa Minamoto, where he could presumably lick his wounds, maybe even cut an amnesty deal. However, one of his retainers betrayed him along the way. He was captured in Owari province, more or less modern Aichi, and executed. His two eldest sons were killed as well. His third and fourth son were spared only because of the personal intercession of Kiyomori's stepmother, Ike no Zenni. Why exactly she stepped in is unclear. The Heiji Monogatari, a dramatized tale describing the events of this conflict, says that it was because Yoshitomo's third son was the spitting image of one of her own kids. Others have theorized maybe she was convinced to step in by Seiwa Minamoto relatives, hoping to salvage something from this whole mess. We simply don't know. All we know is that Kiyomori gave in and sent the third son, Minamoto no Yoritomo, east instead of killing him, entrusting him to a Taira clan ally named Hojo Tokimasa. The fourth brother, Yoshitsune, would be allowed to live as well, but was sent to the Tendai sect temple of Kuramadera outside Kyoto to be raised as an ideally apolitical monk, and I'm sure there's no way that'll come back around to bite anyone in the future. The Hogen and Heiji rebellions had their origins in infighting between parts of the imperial line, but more crucially for us, they revealed how powerful the warrior families had become, and showed that it was they who could tip the balance one way or another in Kyoto itself. Next week, we'll see the warriors not tip the balance, but upend it altogether. But that's a topic for next time. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shout-out tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sy, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, Harrison Reese, Robbie Martin McAvoy, Inoue Enryo's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars, compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for the continued rise of the Samurai class.